Today we're taking a look at some plot details for the capstone to the Infinity Saga, Avengers Endgame. Fair warning that this video will contain spoilers for the movie, so if you don't want to be spoiled yet, put this in your watch later queue. When you do see the movie and you have questions, you can come right back to it. For those that have seen it already, some questions arose from the plot and uses of certain plot devices. Some have said that they're plot holes, but I think they're just misunderstood to be holes. Confused? Stick around. Before we begin though, let me thank you for watching JLS Comics and pressing play. If you like videos like this, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want, the subscribe button as well. I upload new comic book, movie, anime, superhero content every week. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into our video. Avengers Infinity War took place in 2018. The events of Avengers Endgame take place right after Infinity War, and then there's the 5-year time jump and we end up in 2023. So the end of the film is also set in 2023. When Tony snaps with his special Iron Man gauntlet, he restores everything to that point, not to the point where everyone was dusted. Why? Well, one reason, and he made this very clear, was that he wanted to make sure that everything that happened in the past 5 years still happens from 2018 to 2023. Tony had settled down with Pepper Potts. They had a child named Morgan, and he didn't want to lose him. Thanos from 2014, the year that Guardians of the Galaxy and Captain America Winter Soldier were released, traveled through the quantum tunnel to Avengers headquarters in 2023 for the final battle. When Thanos did this, he affected his timeline, splinter timeline that was caused by the Avengers going back to get the time stones. So let's talk about the time travel for a minute, because while the idea has been around since the time vortices were talked about in Ant-Man, this movie leans into the plot device heavily. At some point during the process, Einstein's relativity converts to the Planck scale, which connect gravity, reality, and quantum mechanics like Schrodinger's cat. Schrodinger's cat theory says that all possibilities exist at the same time until one is chosen or revealed, then the rest collapse into this new one version of reality. Like, for example, if you take 3 playing cards, you flip them face down, they could be any of the 52 cards in the deck until I flip them over and reveal what they say. Until then, they are any and all possibilities in the deck. Or take a comic book, for example, that comes in a blind bag. It's every grade of condition at once until you open it up and reveal what it is. In this model and in Endgame, the past you're traveling to is actually now your future, and your old future in that timeline is your past. And in this model, you can't change your own past. So let's expand this conversation a little bit more. There's 2 main types of time travel explored in movies. There's a couple others, but these are the 2 main ones. So there's one where changes to the past cause a butterfly effect to ripple through time and affect the present along one timeline. Sort of like Back to the Future. The other type, the type explored in like Dragon Ball Z, for example, is where you make a change in the past, and once you make that change, that point splinters off and creates an alternate parallel timeline, which is another branch on the tree of time, if you will. In this model, your old, present, and future are not affected, as you've now jumped to a Bravo timeline from your Alpha timeline. So for example, if they went back and killed baby Hitler or baby Thanos, it would create a new reality from that point forward. The Hitler or Thanos in your original timeline would still be around. Only the one where you were trying to change would they be gone. So the Agent One discussed with Bruce during the 2012 Battle of New York in the movie, removing any of the stones from the timeline would create these alternate threads. The only way to remove these new realities, set everything back to normal, is to undo your change and put back what you took, i.e. the stones, Thor's hammer, to the exact moment from which they were taken. That will effectively bring everything back to the one main timeline, your Alpha timeline, and set time as it was originally supposed to flow. That's why Captain America was bringing all the stones back to the past, to that B timeline in the past at the end of the movie, along with Thor's hammer. So this mostly happened, but when Loki disappeared, we don't know where he went. This may have caused another change. When Thanos went from 2014 to 2023, he jumped timelines from timeline B to timeline A, so he affected timeline B. So the Thanos snap from Infinity War still happened. It reduced half of life all over the galaxy by 50%. The streets, the stadiums were empty, less traffic, seas maybe gave way for new life, which is something Thanos thought would happen. People like Joe Russo in his cameo were dealing with PTSD, trauma, loss, moving on, remarrying, defaulted mortgages, all that still happened. When Tony snapped, as I said, it was still 5 years later. The people who remained were 5 years older, but the quote-unquote undusted people like Peter Parker, for example, were the same age as when they died. He told Tony Stark that it was just a few minutes before he regained consciousness, and Doctor Strange said it had been actually 5 years. So that creates some questions going forward for Spidey. While we don't have confirmation, it makes sense that MJ, Ned Leeds, and others were also dusted, as they're all still the same age when we see them in the Spider-Man Far From Home trailers. Their classmates would have still aged and gone on to college or, taken on jobs. The 6th graders at the time when he died were now his new classmates. So there's that option. The other is that his entire school, the entire class was dusted, and that they all continue in the same hierarchy when they returned. Keep in mind that when Thanos said 50% of everything, that doesn't mean an even split between all groups and all populations and all organizations. It could be 0% for one and 100% of another. So 100% of Peter Parker's school got dusted. There's another school out there where nobody got dusted. That average out to 50% still. So really any percentage, as long as the sum of all in the universe equaled that 50%. Okay, so the Steve Rogers thing. At the end of the movie, as per Hulk and the Ancient One, I call her Tau's conversation, the stones needed to be returned to their time periods. Steve did this. He returned the Soul Stone to Red Skull, which would be an interesting story, by the way. Or even how he put the ether back in Jane Foster's womb. Curious about that. Anyways, Steve chose not to use the pin particles to return to the present day. He blew past the time marker, as Banner said at the end of the film. Instead, he went to 1945 to be with Peggy Carter. This is the same year that he kind of disappeared and went into the ice. He specifically mentioned 45, and if you look at the cars at the end, they're very 1945 cars, World War II era. Captain America did visit an elderly Peggy Carter after he came out of the ice, and apparently Peggy had married and had children after Stephen went into the ice. In Captain America the First Avenger, Peggy attempted to distract him from his impending death by setting a date with him, promising to teach him how to dance. This is how the movie ends, right? So we get that moment finally. This is exactly what we see for Endgame. Well, I just didn't want to tell Sam Wilson about the girl, but we're to believe it was Peggy. The version of Cap would have had to step aside when the other Cap was found and thawed from the ice. It's pretty clear throughout the movie that two versions of the same person can exist in the same timeline. The heroes, when they go to 2012 New York, for example. Though for someone like Nebula, quantum entanglement means that their minds are the same, although they're in two different places. And even though he had the super soldier serum, the ice preserved Steve Rogers in his 20-something form. The one that stayed out, our Steve that traveled, was the one that aged. He'd go on to experience the events we saw in the movie and travel back in time again. This creates a sort of time loop where Steve in the ice always comes back, fights Thanos, returns the stones, and stays. Another one ages up, while the young Steve is preserved to continue that loop again. Another theory here is that the timelines diverged when Steve stayed in the past, but when timeline A Steve went back, it allowed for him to kind of step into that empty slot, and that's where timeline A merged back with timeline B, hence how Steve was able to be there with the Avengers despite diverging timeline. Somehow they had to come back together as one. So he probably waited until shortly after Banner sent himself back in time so that he could use that little handheld wrist device to travel back in time again to the spot where they were. Rogers lived a life with Peggy in the alternate timeline, then traveled back to here. That didn't happen, and she didn't have her marriage. The age and death, it appeared as it did in the films already. Cap and Tony went from 2012 New York City to 1970s New Jersey, so you can travel with just the device in the past. You just need the platform to come back to the present. So he did grab enough of the pin particles also from the vials in the 70s to make this all possible. So who's still dead? Tony's still dead. There's two Thanos who are still dead. So the present day one was beheaded in the 5-year time frame that Tony preserved, and then 2014 Thanos from timeline B was dusted in timeline A by 2023 Tony. They're from two divergent timelines, so that's why one doesn't affect the other. But the Infinity War snap was part of the past of the beheaded Thanos and the Avengers, and therefore, it still happened because that past can't be altered without creating the new timeline. Also, still dead are the children of Thanos. They call the Black Order in the comic books. Black Widow remains dead. Her movie will be a prequel of her time in the Red Room, and hopefully something about Budapest, which has been referenced at least 4 times so far in the MCU. There's one Nebula still alive. There's one Gamora still dead. Black Widow and Gamora are either hanging out inside the Soul Stone or spending time with Death in her realm. It could be either one. Really, everyone who died from something other than the snap itself are still dead. Loki, there's maybe another version out there with the Tesseract, we're not sure, or he's truly dead. Not quite sure, but there's a past Loki that disappeared with the Tesseract in New York. We don't know where he went. Maybe that's the Loki that showed up in Infinity War and handed the Tesseract over to Thanos. He had created a different timeline. He preserved one. He had to destroy one to save the other one. So Vision, he was MIA in the movie. Where was he? He will be in WandaVision on Disney+. See, the Avengers traveled back to New York, and in a nod to Winter Soldier, wanted to retrieve the Loki scepter. It was very Winter Soldier-esque. Scott brought that scepter back to the present. Now that had the Mind Stone in it. So that means that there was no Mind Stone in that timeline for Tony to make Vision from. But this kind of contradicts what Banner and Tilda Swinton were talking about and the principles we just discussed about time travel and relativity and physics, which are what this is all founded on for the MCU. Some things here are left purposely ambiguous. Is the timeline fully reset? Does dead really mean dead? Where are some characters? Like we just said, Vision. What happened to the victims and their families now? What about the dimensional threat that Tau warned against? I see these more as future plot devices rather than holes in the logic. And who fixes timelines? king who travels dimensions, Dormammu and Annihilus. That's exactly what the Ancient One was warning against. So just something to think about there. So that's all I have for you today. I want to hear what your theories and questions are, your suggestions on what might be happening or not. So let's continue that conversation down in the comments below. If you're here and haven't already done so, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you'll be part of this rapidly growing JLS Comics family and be one of the first to know each and every time I upload new content every week. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.